We are live right now.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our LAERE-EfD seminar series. We have been conducting these seminars for the whole year, and today we have the great pleasure of having Alex Pfaff. Alex is a professor of public policy, economics, and environment at Duke University. He studies how economic development affects and is affected by natural resources and the environment. His focus is on the impacts of conservation policies and development policies on land use, water quantity and quality, exposures, and the provision and use of information. Today, Alex will tell us many interesting things about the political economy related with the environment. So please, Alex, you are always welcome to our group, and go ahead. Roger will be receiving questions, so if you have questions, you can put them on the chat. And after like 40 minutes, we can start a discussion with all of the participants. So again, welcome, Pfaff, and go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and Roger, thank you. And thank you to LAERE, and great to see a bunch of names that I know, and looking forward to meeting people that I don't know. It's only one person for whom I have to apologize, because I will be using here sort of just a variation on a little keynote talk I gave recently, and there's one person who was there, so they're going to hear the same thing, so I apologize. So let me share my screen here. Are folks able to see it? Yeah, is Roger,
yes,
you're nodding? Okay, great.
Working. Yes.
Okay, great. So as Jorge kindly said, I'll be talking about political economy and deforestation in particular. I'll focus on protection. In the conference where I was talking, a bunch of people were doing all sorts of evaluations of impacts on forests, as of course a lot of you have also done. So I thought I'd focus on protection in particular, and then try to pull out political economy. And in particular, I was trying, and I'm glad to try to pull out, to highlight contributions by PhD students over time. And I'm going to drop some of what I did there because Diego Herrera, I think, is going to present in this series, I think in the spring. And so I'm going to just refer to his work as sort of part of this story, and then he'll tell you more about it, I think, in the spring. And maybe I'll have a little time, as I've snuck in at the bottom there, that title, to mention a few other political economy stories that other folks have been leading. Okay, and at first, maybe just want to call out sort of my, whoopsie, it's not going down. There we go. Call out my appreciation for this community. And here's one way to express it, which is, so I was part of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the global assessment. They have a lot of products. And then recently, for instance, it was nice to see an IPBES IPCC joint assessment on interconnections of climate and biodiversity. And so there's a ton of scientists doing a ton of great work. And you know, how does that work go? When it's a global assessment, there's a lot of ecological focus, and it's a lot of, wow, we're really degrading the earth. Nature's doing great, it's providing us with a lot, but we're starting to beat it up, and it might not be able to provide in the future. All great, all good science, lots of things to be cited, but it tends to end up something like, we need to do something, and let's do some policy. And the thing that I found most frustrating in what's supposed to be an assessment of the last 50 years was, you know, we've tried a lot of public policies. People here have worked on a lot of them. People here have evaluated a lot of them. And so I really wanted to try to push, but it was a little bit frustrating to push. Let's also assess the impacts of past policies. How are we going to have future policies be more impactful than past policies, given that we're clearly still degrading nature? You know, and in that there's a policy chapter, and has lots of nice ideas and balancing and very nice graphics. And sometimes even trade-offs are mentioned. But, you know, I ended up thinking, well, who do you folks think are going to do all these policies, and who will implement them? And what will they be maximizing? And so that's what made me think that sort of highlighting the political economy of underlying policy choice and thinking about policy impact evaluation, could be useful for that group. So here I'm going to contrast 3 protection stories. First, I'm going to only skim Diego Herrera's thesis. He was at Duke, and I was working with him as an advisor. And the political economy here, this first 2, is going to be what looks to me like interactions between agencies focused on development and agencies focused on conservation. And protection is going to look like a symptom of who might be, quotes, winning. I'm never going to observe bargaining between these agencies. I'm just going to observe protection, and it's when protection occurs, when protection is reversed, and the impacts of that. And so in Diego's thesis, his first chapter is protection gets created. And in particular, it has positive spillovers. And the question is, why would it have positive spillovers? Is it potentially sending signals that the environmental agency won a political argument and thus sending signals to private and public actors who respond? Quite the opposite is Daria Kellis's thesis. She just finished it, and that's on PAD, protected area elimination. So when protected areas are eliminated, maybe that's a signal that the environmental agency has lost the political argument. And then how do you get conservation? It looks like conservation by loss evasion. If I'm going to lose a protected area, the smart thing to do might be to lose the protected area that has achieved the least. That was our hypothesis. And then finally, just a really kind of different story, because I want to throw it out there, is in the first 2 stories, everyone who's doing development rejects protection. Like, you never want protected areas. They block you from development. So then how come it looks to me like sometimes people are inviting protection? When does development actually want environmental policy? And I think the answer can be that if we break the development forces up into 2 groups, low capital and high capital, sometimes the low capital are losing to the high capital. And then there can be a coalition, a political economic coalition between part of development and environment, in which case maybe you can get conservation by excluding high capital to the benefit of both low capital development and conservation. Those are the 3 stories I'd just like to tell, throw a little bit of evidence up, get your responses, and we'll see how the time goes, because the first one I'll just do very quickly. I'll just say quickly, Diego, finished his PhD. He went to the University of Vermont, has some really nice work using the DHS data with that group. The health surveys that are pretty common around the world. Upstream forest lowers disease downstream. He went to EDF, where he was working, say, with Ruben Lebowski, including on Brazil, like these tradable quotas, and recently moved to the World Bank, where he's been working on changing wealth of nations. And what I'm about to say just a few words about was his ERIE presentation from June. And so, again, he's building on this idea of protected areas that had positive spillovers. What's the political economy? We think states care about local cost. Federal actors probably care more about the positive forest spillovers. So state and federal actors might have different incentives. And he looked at protected areas outside the Brazilian Amazon arc of deforestation, where part of our story is it doesn't matter what incentives you have if you're in a context where you can't have impact. So he says outside the arc, nobody has impact, not federal, not state, not indigenous. But in the arc of deforestation, in particular, I'll just show the state of Pará, which also has variation in pressure. Federal protected areas have impacts and they have positive spillovers. So leakage would be that protected areas spill over and deforestation occurs more outside the protected area than it would otherwise. This is what I would call blockage. The protected area sort of has a halo of lower deforestation around it. And we wondered why. And our thought was about political economy and signaling. Let's assume there's no tourism, which is not usually the story there. Laura Villalobos, I see here, has some work with tourism. And I'm thinking about agencies who are battling it out for influence. And I'm thinking that if you establish a protected area, that could signal that this area is going to be green, not brown. And if that signal is sent, do other players respond? Do private actors respond with migration? That's one of his chapters. The answer is yes. Does road building respond, both private and public? And the answer is yes. In Erie, and he'll tell you more about it in the spring, the details, federal protected areas are lowering road building. And I haven't seen results like that, that the conservation is shaping development. And it makes sense, right? If the rest of the government's not going to support development in an area, then I should probably build roads somewhere else, or I should migrate to where I can get a job. If you think that signaling could be going on. So we don't see the signals, we don't see the bargaining, but it looks like other people are responding to protection by not building roads. He'll tell you more about it in the spring plus migration. And he's at the bank again. So now I'm going to go to the opposite story. Instead of conservation wins, conservation loses. So in Daria just finished her thesis in Nancy in France. She might well do a postdoc doing more protected area elimination in the US. But that said, if people have projects, you're looking for good analysts, she's also wondering if she'd want to touch on other topics. And there's her email down in the corner. So yeah, I can move on to what she's done. We're working with folks at Conservation International who are keeping the PAD or protected area elimination database going. And D is for the first D in PAD is for de-gazette or eliminate a protected area. The second D is for downsize or eliminate part of a protected area. And the third D is for downgrade, keep the same area but give it lower status. And her first chapter was on the risk of PAD. And we're thinking about, again, I'm thinking about anyway, I'm speculating that there's this sort of contestation between agencies with different interests. And the first result she finds in the risk of PAD is that it occurs more near cities with low travel costs, where the pressure is higher and economic returns are higher. And that looks like the development agency is kind of winning. They're getting PAD or protected area elimination in the places that are best for them. On the other hand, PAD is occurring where there's been more forest loss already inside the protected area. So that looks a little bit more like what the Environment Agency might do. If I'm going to lose a protected area, maybe I should lose the one that's failing, right? Because then, you know, I don't like losing, but maybe I'll lose less. And so this little set of pictures comes from the prior paper by Antone Pfaff on just one state in the Brazilian Amazon. And the thing I think is interesting is the two pictures to the right of the two cases. It's hard to see those pictures. The blue lines in those two figures to the right are telling you that the piece of two protected areas that got removed was highly deforested. And the red lines are telling you that the piece that didn't get removed was not deforested at all. And in fact, interestingly, that piece was upgraded. It was given more protection. So it almost looks like there's some kind of rational trading going on where failed protection vanishes and successful protection gets doubled down on. And I don't think that's coordinated, actually. I don't think the agencies are working together. I think this looks like kind of rational trading in a contested framework. You know, so you can decide if you think those things are really happening. Here we throw out a little evidence that says, oh, look, it's not apparently random which pieces of which protected areas vanish. And that's the spirit in which Daria keeps studying the whole Amazon for protected area elimination. So Mike Masha is the person who's really pushed on PAD for a long time. PAD tracker is where the data are. It used to be WWF, now it's CI. PAD is rising globally over time. And so Daria overlays the protected areas that were not eliminated and the protected area eliminations. And the Brazilian Amazon is huge, right? As I always say, there are municipalities that are bigger than European countries. And the states are super different economically as well as politically. So we're going to break things down by different states. To the left, they also list in the PAD documents the proximate cause of what led to the elimination of the part of the protected area. And to the left, we're looking at Rondônia primarily with a little bit of spillover to Amazonas, and the cause was new infrastructure. To the upper right, we're looking at Roraima, much further north, much more isolated. The cause was local land claims. And to the lower right, we're looking at Pará, which again has quite a variation in pressure depending on where you are. You can see the red lines to the lower left. New road is being put in, a lot more deforestation, and infrastructure is mentioned as well as rural settlement. So we're going to break those up because in the paper, we try to talk about if you thought a conservation agency was going to try to avoid forest loss, even though they were going to lose a protected area, how would they do it? What kind of settings would they give up? And what kind of settings would they not? So we talk about different settings and that we think the impacts of PAD would vary across them. So that's what I'm going to try to quickly talk about. check the time there. So yeah, we got a million pixels. Forest is 30% cover. You know, most of them are unprotected, or about at half. Of the protected areas, you know, most stay protected the whole time. Some get reduced. I'll just say that the pad events occur between 2009 and 2012. That's nice in the sense that it allows us, even with this Hansen data, to have pre-treatment deforestation from 01 to 08. And I'll just mention, in case anyone's actually looking at those numbers, which I know is difficult at high speed on Zoom, that more protected areas were created during 01 and 08. So the set of things that we can look at from 09 is larger. I'll just say, of course, we have to do a bunch of balancing. First, we actually test whether these protected areas had impacts at all between 01 and 08. And it is a striking fact that the protected areas that were downsized have higher deforestation than the baseline. They have negative impacts. They don't block deforestation. They appear to invite it, which is looking really non-random. So the selection of what is downsized really seems to be an issue. That's what we're focused on. So here's a story. When would getting rid of a protected area probably not make a huge difference in the short run, at least, when there's not a lot to do with protection? So Roraima looks like that. Green is the background deforestation. Blue is the constant protected area deforestation. Red is the reduced protected area deforestation. And they're all really low. So it's not shocking that after that vertical line, when the 2009 event occurred, everything looks the same. So just like the sort of flip side of Diego's result, that the protected areas were not doing that much under low pressure, getting rid of a protected area doesn't seem to do that much under low pressure. Makes sense. Okay, another case is essentially the opposite. What if protected areas are just being totally overrun? That's what it looks like in Pará, right near that new road. You can see it in that prior picture. Again, green is the background. Both the red, the selected for reduction protected areas, and the blue, the not reduced protected areas, are just getting crushed before the 2012 event. And at that point, you really have no great prior, but you don't have any great reason to think that getting rid of an overrun protected area is going to make a difference. And we find that it doesn't. I'll show you the summary in a moment. Third case is a little bit more interesting. Here you have further away from that road in Pará, there's pressure and there's some impacts of protected areas. So again, the green is the baseline, and the blue line, which is the protected areas that stay the same, they're clearly blocking some, which is good. That's consistent with Diego's results as well. The red line of the reduced protected areas is higher, not tons higher, but it's higher. So there's clearly some selection going on. And in that sense, if, and this is a very crude sentence here, if to first order, protection is just not that effective. So the baseline, the deforestation in a reduced protected area is close to the background or baseline deforestation, then you don't necessarily expect getting rid of the protection to make a big difference in the short run either. And this is all very fast, but I'll just say, if you take those three cases and we do that in these panel regressions, sort of difference in difference panels, you don't find any impact in at least the short run on deforestation from the legal elimination of the protection. Okay, but it's not the only cases. Rondônia is actually the dominant case. It's the biggest area. And if you look at that upper left picture, this is really what drives what I told you before. The red line is deforestation, and to the left, before the pad, so while it was still protected, in the protected areas that will be reduced. It's way above the green line, right? Protected areas look like an invitation to deforest. The blue protected areas that are left the same are the opposite. They're actually blocking something. So, and the other thing you notice is that, boy, does that red line fall. So that's probably, almost surely, the effects of all these other policies in the Brazilian Amazon after 04 to 07. So we need to also ask ourselves, after the pad event, do those other background policies stay the same or not? And that's a tough challenge, but I'll just say, for the Brazilian Amazon, you have to deal with that for this time period. So yeah, that's what I just said. So we try a little bit of matching on sort of fixed characteristics. That makes almost no difference. But again, as I mentioned, we have the 01 to 08 deforestation. So we thought, in the spirit of parallel trends tests in panels, we can also match on the 2001 to 2008 deforestation. And if we use a caliper, we'll end up only looking at the protected areas that have, quotes, decent matches. And that's this last picture in the bottom right. So that's a subset of the protected areas that are reduced, as you can see, the ones that are closer to kind of background deforestation. They have the best matches, how good they are, we can always go look. But we passed the caliper. And for those, if you look at the places that have essentially not already been overrun, there, it looks like the vertical line, the 2010 PAD event in which you eliminate legal protection, is unleashing more deforestation. And this is no doubt what people were worried about when they started studying PAD. If you get rid of protection, deforestation is going to shoot upwards. In some of the Rondoni protected areas, it looks like that. In a place with pressure where it's a little bit blocked, or it's even only just blocked to baseline, in this case, it looks like getting rid of legal protection is an invitation to deforestation. Okay, so that's the sort of story in Daria's, I'm looking at the time here, work on the signaling of all the agents who are deforesting, who don't want protection, of eliminating protected areas. And as long as, I don't get to talk to you all that often, I'll just quickly tell you this other story. So in the upper right, I say, remember, in all those stories, nobody doing development wants protection. Protection constrains development. So then why do extractive reserves exist? In particular, why is the story that I've heard over time about, say, the Chico Mendes extractive reserve near the Interoceanic Highway in Brazil, where the rubber tappers were, why does the story sound to me like the rubber tappers asked to have a protected area? Please create a protected area that will limit me. Well, maybe if you're getting, beaten down in many ways by higher capital actors, if you're losing in the land market, if you're losing in the violence market, right? We know Chico Mendes was shot, right? Could you, as a small extractive producer, potentially win in the political market by essentially inviting an ally of the environmental or conservation community? Right? They always say that an enemy of my enemy is my friend. So how could a protected area be my friend? By really limiting the person who's beating on me. So if I agree to be restricted in an extractive reserve with, low smallholder extraction, you might call that a restriction, but maybe I would call that a right. Maybe what you've done is held other people off, so I'll at least get the right to do the production at the level that we've agreed. And if that's true, then I might actually love it because you've blocked the people who beat on me. So this is a thing I was wondering about, and I've essentially tried to just ask a bunch of people, have you ever seen this? So we have this draft paper that I failed to write up, but many, many people have contributed cases. Seeing Juan Camilo there, I'll borrow one that Luz Rodriguez told me about. I think I'll mispronounce it, the Yagoje Apaporis, I think, indigenous reserve in Colombia, in which mining companies, as I understand the story, are invading. So there are de jure indigenous rights, but they're not working. And as I understand it, the indigenous groups go to the environmental agencies and say, please, could we make this a protected area where you help me defend this? And not surprisingly, in the political economic battle, as I understand the story, the mining company said, oh, ho, ho, well, you are not representative of all indigenous groups. I can find indigenous folks who say they want me to be there, which you can imagine with, income and jobs and all this. I think it goes to the Colombian Supreme Court, who I think uphold the agreement and the request to combine the protection with the indigenous. So like, who does that? Who says, please restrict me? And again, it looks like people who are losing. Think of Indonesia and co-management agreements with, this is Charlie Palmer's work, in which folks were getting crowded out by higher capital cocoa farmers, and they asked to be part of agreements with TNC. Mozambique is an MPA. Small fisher people could easily agree that you want to have an extractive reserve where big boats are kept out, but canoes are allowed in. Right? I'll agree to do less in my canoe if you agree to keep out the big boats. So we're trying to write this up. I'd be interested if any of you know of examples or you disagree. I think it's an interesting political economic coalition that in principle could help address sort of, many of the SDGs, the conservation side, as well as the returns to smallholders. Okay, maybe just maybe a few more minutes, I guess. I'm looking at the time. Having gotten through that, so that was the political economy of protection, where again, the last story is private groups vary, and the private groups who are losing might win by having a coalition with conservation. And the other two stories are public agencies vary, right? Some, like in the United States, EPA and Department of Agriculture do not have the same mandate. They are not always cooperating in terms of which groups they're trying to help. In terms of Diego's paper, creating protection seems to send a green signal and chase away migration and roads. Again, he will spell it out for you, I believe, in the spring. In terms of Darius' paper, getting rid of a protected area, I think, is a signal that conservation has lost. What appears to be the response, try to lose the things that hurt least. So it's, you know, relative conservation by evasion, whereas Diego's is essentially conservation by dissuasion when you win the argument. Okay, and as long as I see I have a few minutes, I'll mention a few other people's papers. And I'm part of all these, but I'm not leading them. I'll just, to set up this other PhD student, I'll talk about a paper that Aaron Sills led in terms of political economy. This is the Pará state, again, in Brazilian Amazon. There's a green municipalities program, Programa Municípios Verdes, funded by the Amazon Fund. The document says we will lower deforestation, and we're going to do it by empowering state actors. And my question was immediately, why would state actors who are barely towing the line for a federal constraint, especially under the blacklist, why would empowering a state actor lower deforestation when they're already being federally constrained below what they would choose on their own? Like, I just don't see why that would happen. If anything, we thought, and Aaron was thinking, well, maybe we could empower the local actors to satisfy the federal constraint at lower costs, so there'd be local benefits. And maybe that's good for regulation because there's more political sustainability of regulations. And that's what we found. If we found no impact on deforestation of the PMEV, but an increase in the value added, as if economic activity could be higher, conditional on satisfying the federal deforestation constraint. Is that what's happening? We can't prove it. But we were trying to lay out, you know, as you think about investments and things like this, maybe we should think about why we think it would change deforestation, or if we do think it would at all. So that Fed state, you know, difference in interests, as Diego has highlighted as well, sets up this paper by Patricia Ruggiero on the ICMS in Brazil, which is a program for the feds to essentially bribe people to create protected areas. They hand out value-added tax to municipalities as a function of their share of total protected areas by state. You look at the formula for that, as this community would do, and you say, okay, that could work, except for, wait a second, you divide up the money according to the share of total protected areas. So the very first year you create that, boy, that could be really good, because the first person to create a protected area gets all the money. That's a pretty good incentive. 20 years later, there's a ton of protected areas. Creating a new protected area basically gets you no more share of the cash. So you wouldn't think it would matter so much unless there are protected areas that cost you essentially nothing. So that's what we find. The effect falls over time, but an ongoing creation is municipalities create APAs, or super unrestricted protected area category, that you can actually overlay on top of any other protected area category. And as best I can tell, it doesn't limit anything. So if that might get me a few cents of, you know, value added tax, and it doesn't cost me anything, I'll keep creating it. So that's what it looks like. And Patricia just got that published. And finally, just highlighting her work. Oh, I should just say, so she just finished her PhD a little bit ago at the University of Sao Paulo in ecology, actually, but she has a background in government. And now she's doing a postdoc and working with the government in Sao Paulo. So that's someone who maybe, you know, will fit in this community as well. She also has a paper on elections, because there's temporal variation in political economy. When elections are coming, suddenly people sometimes want to buy votes. That's what it looks like. Deforestation in the Atlantic forest rises in the years of federal and state elections, in the places with high pressure, and municipal elections in the places with low pressure. And it rises more when the same parties in power at the federal, state, and municipal levels. As you would think, there's more ability to coordinate to buy votes by handing away forests. And that's in the Atlantic forest. Someone else has a paper on the Brazilian Amazon. And you kind of think of the Atlantic forest as a place with, regulatory power, but yet that's where these results are coming. So I've told a lot of stories there. I will stop.
Thank you, Alex. This was a very insightful presentation, and we have plenty of time. We have about 25 minutes for questions and comments. We already have some in the chat, so I prefer to invite people to open your microphone and ask directly to Alex your questions. Santiago, can you please ask your question? You was first in the list.
Yes, thank you, Alex, for the presentation. Going back to the graph that shows that the deforestation was higher in the protection area you surrendered, or that you got unprotected, but it shows that it wasn't working in the data you have.
Yeah.
But look at 1990 or 1970 on whether it actually worked at some point in time, the protection, or can you say, well, it actually never worked?
Yeah.
So there's a turning point that maybe they started the movement to unprotected, or it never worked.
Yeah, that's, this is it could not be better timing, Santiago. And poor Santiago is the person who saw this before, so I apologize. So the nice thing is that Daria submitted this and just got a revise and resubmit. And we kind of expected this, right? Because when she started it, Hansen was the thing that everyone was using. And now a bunch of people use the global, starting to use the global sort of European or Norway data. I don't remember what we call that. But for at least a number of countries with Amazon, there's now Mapbiomas data. In fact, I think we're up to like version 5 of Mapbiomas. And I'm not the expert on these detection data. But one of the nice things about it is Mapbiomas, I think, starts in 1988, whereas Hansen started in 2000. So we are actually quite eager, as is the referee, but it fits very well, to look earlier. And now we can look earlier and think about, even if we had this pulse in the 2000s, I think this is the picture you were thinking of, Santiago, but I'm sorry if it's the wrong one. What was going on earlier? So I don't know yet. And I think it's a great question, and we're going to be finding out in the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you. Adriana Molina?
Yes, hi Alex, how are you?
Hey, Adriana.
Yes, so I have kind of like 2 related questions. So for the first one, I was wondering what type of categories of kind of like protected areas are you included in the analysis for the Brazilian case, especially because you were kind of like mentioning the case of these private units of conservation that could also be a potential category. And since this is kind of like being connected to the story of bargaining between agencies of kind of like environmental protection and agencies of more sustainable production, I was wondering if there are like other potential reasons that may explain kind of like why some of these protected areas are being eliminated or formed. And in a related question, I was also wondering if these areas you are considering here are inhabited, or kind of like what could potentially explain this pressure for deforestation in these areas you have chosen.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on there. Let me see if I can remember them. First, I will say, just the other day, I was on the phone with Rodrigo Arriagada and someone else who had noticed, who in their database, was pointing out that there's a lot of private protected areas in Chile. And that has not been what we're focused on here. I don't think we have any private protection in this database. We do have these multiple use protected areas, which fits to your question about type, in which there is, in the definition of the rules, you have, in various forms in various places, smallholders allowed to have limited extraction. That would then be one case of, yes, it's inhabited, but more generally, I think there are people inside these protected areas. I'll just say that, for instance, Sebastian Costedoat at CI is doing an analysis now, and someone else has one also, on the impacts of Bolsa Verde, and actually LAERE is part of this, if I'm not mistaken, PES inside protected areas. So there's definitely an issue of people inside. And if I remember correctly, Seb is finding no impact of PES in PAs, but yes, impact of PES in settlements. And Laura maybe can correct me if that's wrong. All right, she hasn't said anything yet. So yes, there are people inside. There often have historically been, but yes, there's also invasion in the sense that people weren't living there, and people decide they want to go in and produce. I mean, I should also say that I guess, at least in the Brazilian case, it's not always go in and produce for the profit of production, but go in and quotes produce in order to acquire the ability to sell the land, right? Because if you quotes improve land or use it or sort of have the right of being there for a certain amount of time, you can sometimes get the land under your control. So it's not that the output during those years is the source of profit, but it's the acquisition of land control. I think that is also happening a bunch. As for types, you're right that in the Diego story, actually I didn't highlight it, but we do break down strict versus multiple use protection, but the strongest stories are federal versus state, and which state across these different contexts that I've just highlighted. For instance, you saw for Diego in the low pressure states, there's no impact at all, so then there's no spillovers. In this pad work, I don't think we have a result on protected area type affecting the probability of pad. I kind of feel like we've asked that and I can't remember it, but I'm sorry, Adrian, I can't think of it. And it'll make me go check.
Okay, I'm following the order in the chat, but you can also raise your hands and I will try to keep the order. Viviana Garcia is next, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. So I think I have a question more like clarification. So I think that I got lost in the when you explain what variables are you using for the matching, and then also what does this mean for the interpretation of your results? Because I think that I got confused a little bit about like the like something that we could call like a pre-trend, or like the the behavior of these two groups before 2010. So perhaps you could elaborate on this a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so back in the day, with fewer years of deforestation data, the matching that at least I was involved in tended to be fixed characteristics over space. Like Lucas Joppa and I in our first global paper, we were just trying to say, folks, this is not econometric precision. But if you just look at distance to road, distance to city, and slope, we think you're going to find huge differences between protected places and unprotected places, which means you got to be careful when you run regressions saying that protection has an impact, because you're comparing isolated places on high slopes to non-isolated places on low slopes. And so literally those three variables collected globally, if you match on those alone, we were cutting the estimated impacts of protection in half. So at one level, the first story is big, gigantic spatial differences. But we only see so many variables, especially globally, forget for the whole Amazon, and we know they're not everything that matters, right? So what matters? Well, one of the nice things about things like synthetic cohort is thinking about, well, maybe what happened in the past is a good indicator of how much matters. So sometimes when we think about, like for instance, in the work with Aaron on the Green Municipalities Program, there's only one state that implemented this program. So we're trying to build a synthetic match to the municipalities in that state using other blacklisted municipalities in other states. What are we doing it with? Well, following that sort of method, past deforestation. So is past deforestation a useful summary statistic of all the conditions that matter for deforestation? In a way, it has to be, right? Because past deforestation is the summary statistic for deforestation. And you can decide what you think about things like synthetic cohort. Now, coming to try to answer your question about, say, the pictures I have up here. In the upper left, there's no matching at all. In the upper right, there's fixed characteristics matching. And even with a caliper, boy, did we not end up with anything like similarity. In the bottom right is what I probably very unclearly referenced, Viviana, which is here we take the protected areas that were reduced in size. And then we look for protected areas that were not reduced in size that had, similar quotes, or the most similar we could, but with a caliper, a certain level is similar, deforestation rates between 01 and 08. Or, since that was very hard to do, we looked for, and I'm actually glad to get the chance to say this, after the new policies came in from 04 to 07 and things, somewhat stabilized, or that had similar deforestation rates from 2007 forward. So say in the bottom right picture, 07 to 10 would then be the pre-treatment period, where we have closer to a chance of being, we have some treated, which is to say size reduced, and some untreated, constant sized protected areas with quotes similar enough, is it enough? We have to all decide, but more similar deforestation rates. That's what I was matching on there. The past deforestation, and in the Brazilian Amazon, it is tough from 04 to 07 because the world really changed, as you can see in the upper left picture. And everyone knows that, and that's the credit that you give to the various policies, and we can talk about those. So I think the simplest way to think about what we were trying in the bottom right is post those policies being in place, looking for a decent match on 07 to 10 deforestation rates, and then comparing those things post 10, in which case you see that the red line, or the places that did lose their protection, jump up in deforestation. I don't know if I've answered your question. Feel free to follow up if I didn't.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, very clear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Viviana. Juan Camilo is next.
Great to see you, Alex. This is very, very interesting and very provocative. So I want to come to a couple statements that you said and pick your brain again on the political economy, because you were trying to suggest, if I read correctly, that there might be conservation initiatives that may lead to development, and you literally said nobody doing development wants conservation, right? So may or may not lead to development.
I see. Yeah.
But nobody doing development wants conservation. And if I understood part of your argument at the very beginning, which I want to hear your ideas on that,
yeah,
about the high capital ratio that is particularly associated with the development initiatives that probably don't want to do conservation. So if we're talking about political economy and the capital ratio, what's the role of the low capital ratio in the initiatives for conservation that is achieving successfully some things? And you mentioned indigenous communities in alliances with courts. So courts and indigenous groups are achieving things despite the lack of high capital ratio in that sense. So what's the role of capital here that is doing one thing and is not doing the other one? How? I just want to hear more on that.
Yeah, well, it's possible. I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds like I've miscommunicated somewhat. But I will say the following, that my general belief is that actors who are trying to use land for production, such as in agriculture or in mining, do not vote for protected areas. And I think the proof of that is that when you find protected areas, they end up in non-average places, right? And that's why we do the matching. So in general, people who are trying to use land use for their own purposes push protection away. And that's what I mean by people don't want their development blocked by conservation. By the way, I think that's true of low capital people too. If I walk up to your average, poor frontier landholder, and now we're not talking about one where we're talking about local water quality, Ostrom Commons local benefits. But if I just say you individually, would you like the government to cut in half what you're allowed to do? I'm pretty sure the answers are basically no. So that's my core statement. But one way to get people to say, yes, I would like you to come in and restrict development in this place is if a higher capital actor who can beat you in the land market, who can beat you in the violence market, who can beat you in the corruption market, right? Like we hear a story in Bolivia that there's going to be red payments, and someone hires a smart lawyer, I'll call that a form of capital, to go to the capital and change all the deeds so the indigenous folks lose their land, and then they go out and burn it down, right? So you can lose in a lot of ways to people who have resources. If you are losing, such as Chico Mendes is losing to more highly capitalized farmers, and we're not talking huge capital, we're talking more than rubber tappers, then it makes sense in my mind, in principle, and to me, it looks like it's happening in the world, and that's what we're doing here with these cases, that you would say, please come restrict economic activity here. Why? Because I want to be restricted? No, but I want you to restrict the people who are taking my stuff. So that is the story. That's it. And now, what is the role of capital? At that point, capital can do lots of things. In fact, I imagine that I could even argue in a land sparing sense to give capital to those low capital folks who are in protected areas so they could have more output on a smaller area of land, right? So there's lots of stories on what does capital do in the production function, and land sparing is one of them. But mine was more about two groups who vary in their power, economic and political, and using protection in a coalition against the more powerful to acquire sort of blocking rights for the less powerful. That was the nature of that story.
Right. And by the way, just quickly, when you were mentioning about the land markets, the land transactions,
yep,
that's definitely the case, for example, for Colombia, that deforestation is being driven by the land market, not because people are acquiring land for the revenues from the land use. It's just the
right,
valuation of the land.
Exactly.
The overvaluation of the land is just driving deforestation so badly. Yep. And it is a very different monster right now, totally, to understand deforestation through that than the usual things that it's growing coca leaves or the like. Yeah,
completely. I mean, that said, I should just say, I mean, I think markets are sometimes doing interesting things. I recall visiting Sao Paulo State and Movimento Sem Terra place where there's an advocacy for land reform. The land got divided and immediately got rented back to the high capital guy because it was more productive with capital. And then the people who got the land then got hired by the high capital guy. So the land reform worked in the sense of cash, but actually the high capital ended up efficiently doing all the hiring and producing anyway. So, I mean, there are many stories, but that's one in which you cooperate with respect to the rights. And the stories that I'm worried about is where the rights are being violated.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We have two more people. Francisco Alpizar, please.
Hi, Alex. Nice to see you again.
You too, but I'm now trying to find a picture of you so I can actually see you. Where are you? Darn.
Yeah, I cannot turn my video on.
Oh, there you are. Okay, yeah, okay. I see your name.
Wonderful to hear you too, Alex. Your ideas are great as usual. So my question has to do with the following. So I believe that the risk of deforestation might change in time as economic activities change.
Yeah.
In response to prices, and also the ecological value of a given protected area might change in time as the underlying ecosystem changes or ecosystem services become more or less valuable.
Yeah.
For example, in response to climate change. So
yeah,
this might result in a development versus conservation discussion or conflict that is shifting in space and over time
Yep.
So maybe it's not conservation losing to development or vice versa. But simply changing or shifting preferences.
Yep.
How is this captured by your argument?
So this picture the picture that I put up could be that, right? Because what I said was, I mean, because you're essentially giving us a rational trading story, right? Like even if all the rights were, I mean, I think you're giving me a rational trading story, and tradable development rights is a thing, and I believe in that, right? Like Diego and Ruben and EDF are saying, it makes more sense to conserve some here and to develop some there. And then if we take your story, if that changes over time, then we have tradable development rights, we could trade them again. So I completely agree with that. That's actually why I put this picture up. I don't know if can you still see the picture, Francisco? Do I have a picture up there for everybody?
No, I can't.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Maybe I stopped sharing. I'm not sure. Anyway, this is the picture of Pad and Rondonia, in which what I said was, it is it could look like literal rational trading, which I could tell in your version, which is, I could tell a version using your language. Over time, we realize that, say, the profits to be had on half of this protected area are enormous. And it turns out, because of climate change, the species there, whatever, they all went away. They actually left. The birds flew off, right? Yeah. And thus, there's a rational trade to be had where, how about this, guys? Because my birds aren't even in that half, and you happen to be able to grow bananas there. How about you just take that, but you double down the protection and you help me guard my half, right? That could easily happen. In fact, you get in trouble in the ecological space raising this, right? But climate change is making it necessary that if the benefits are going to move around with climate change, as you said, you got to at least think about what are the ways in which we're going to switch, you know, from protection here to protection there, since we might not be able to keep all the protected areas and add the new ones. Yeah, and so I don't know. I wasn't there in the room for this Rondonia switch, but that's why I characterized it as maybe this is just contestation and people fight less hard to save what they've already lost. But maybe it's rational trading and they realize they're both maximizing objectives that shift over time. So I absolutely think that could happen, Francisco. I actually think that kind of trading is going to have to occur over time. And to the extent it's rational and we can do integrated maximization of development and environment benefits, super. And maybe integrated maximization is going to occur in a contested way, just because who fights hard for what they care most about. So I agree with your point, and I think it fits with one interpretation of what we saw in those two cases in Rondonia.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and we have one question from Carlos Munoz, and I think at the end we can squeeze a final question as well.
Or we can give people free time. When do we ever get that? That would be popular. That would be good.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks everybody for organizing this event. I really enjoyed, and Alex, thanks for your presentation. So
nice to see you.
I have a question a little bit related to the argument on linking this issue to political economy and the enemy. I got a little bit confused on the enemy, but so my question may not make sense. But anyways, I think, you know, when we have protected areas, we have different levels of decision making going on. So sometimes we have the states overimposing a protected area. No matter who is on the ground, they'll just put it on, and they you know, write the polygon, and boom, here we have a new park.
Yeah.
But then that decision affects everybody else, especially at the political economy level. So you create these potential conflicts, and then you create these opportunities for the enemy to join in with the other enemy in order to kick somebody out. So I want to follow on that argument and that logic on the context of countries deciding where to protect in order to fight climate change. So we have these huge opportunities in the tropics, which we call natural climate solutions right now, where carbon is seated in the form of protection. So who are going to be the enemies there, and who are going to be the friends there, in order to make these protected areas be more efficient at protecting the carbon that is there, or expanding and creating larger protected areas, and how is that going to affect this argument on the enemies, and who's are we going to invite in order to bring this idea of development linked to climate change? I don't know if that makes sense, Alex, but
so I think that I didn't communicate the enemy very well, but let me borrow where I think you're asking and try to go in the similar direction. So I think that we need to think about the incentives of the local stakeholders, and I think that fits with the story you told. And for instance, a multiple use protected area that allows some production, such as the one in the slide there, I don't know if you all can see it, in principle has gains for local producers. And if they feel like they have gains, then two things can happen. This is one we've been saying for a while. I see Juan Robelino is on the call. We've been saying this, for instance, for the picture we're talking about here in Acre for a long time, which is if there are gains for somebody local versus a very strict protected area that kicks everybody out, you might be able to get your protected area closer into the action. And I think that's efficient, Carlos. If you can get a protected area in a place where something's actually happening, then you might actually change deforestation rates. A lot of protected areas go to places where nothing is happening, such as the Roraima case I showed you earlier. So you got a protected area and you didn't kick anyone out, but you also didn't do anything because nothing was happening. The other thing that can happen is people who are motivated locally can be part of monitoring enforcement, right? These days they got cell phones. They can call and say, hey, someone's here, come enforce. Plus the satellites can see fires and all that stuff. So that language is sort of that a properly incentivized smallholder, local smallholder, could be a friend of conservation. Now let me use the word enemy. One enemy, there's two versions of enemy, as you just said. One enemy of the local smallholder is a strict protected area that kicks them out. I agree. And that's what I was saying to First Order in the first answer to Juan Camilo. The second one, though, is a different actor who's bigger and more powerful and can kick them out. So there I was saying that a local smallholder who might be open to being in a multiple use extractive reserve might really be open to it if it protects them from being kicked out by a more powerful private actor. So I was using the language, the big powerful producer is the enemy of the local producer. Why? Because the local producer is getting kicked out or killed, right? Or also whatever negative things. In which case, if the conservation folks come in and they block the powerful private actor, they're blocking the enemy of the small local actor, and that could make conservation the friend of the small local actor. That was the language I was trying to use. I think it's consistent with your question in my sense of, I think it's going to be easier to actually get conservation into the action by doing a good job working with local interests. And while we're at it, we might actually have more impact in those places. And while we're at it, if you actually value the other SDGs for development, you get that as well. That's the direction I was going there. I don't know if I've answered your question though, Carlos.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, thank you all. We ran out of time. I don't know if there's a very short, very quick question. Otherwise, we have to finish. I think it was a wonderful seminar. Thank you, Alex. A big applause for you. And I don't know if Jorge has some final remarks.
I just want to say thank you, LAERE, thank you, Roger and Jorge, and all of you for coming and paying attention and asking questions. I really appreciate it. Nice to see you all.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your time and for the presentation. Very, very interesting. A lot of interesting questions as well. Huge attendance. So we are very happy to have you here with the LAERE-EfD seminar series. Please remember that every first Wednesday in the month, we have this seminar. So the first one will be like 4 weeks from now. So please keep in touch with this seminar series. And again, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, Roger, for conducting the Q&A session. And thank you all for coming. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much, Alex.
Gracias. Saludos, profe Jorge.